Welcome back, viewers. This will be our third episode of Behind the Curtain. This series of Dave and Steve's videos is makers and shakers behind the scenes of some of the world's most popular music. Steve, who are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, we've got an extraordinarily interesting figure today, a guy by the name of Phil Spector. Phil Spector, who arguably is among the most influential record producers in the history of popular music, even though he really hasn't been active for decades. Spector created a kind of distinctive sound and had certainly a distinctive persona. And he is one of the, he's almost bigger than life in a sense. So, but a very, very unusual figure. But we're going to talk a little bit about Phil Spector today.
And in addition to the hits that he produced, and there were dozens, he also had an incredible influence on a generation of producers that followed. Just taking Brian Wilson as an example of the Beach Boys. So Absolutely. His influence can hardly be understated.
I mean, one of the things that we'll talk a bit more about this, but one of the things that Spector really introduced is the idea that the studio could become almost a kind of instrument, that the production and the production techniques could create a sound that was almost inexplicable. And that when people heard a record from the early 1960s, for example, boy, you could tell it was a Spector produced record. And so a fascinating figure, and as you suggest, Dave, a really highly influential guy as well. But I guess, as they say, the elephant in the room is that Phil Spector his current residence is in prison. And so we should talk just briefly about why Spector's in prison and won't be eligible for parole for a few years.
Yeah, so the same prison that Charlie Manson was in, right?
Yeah, right, in the California state system. And so Phil Spector will turn 80 this year, in December of this year, and he spent the last decade and a half or so behind bars for the murder of for a murder.
Murder of Lena Clarkson. A would-be actress, model. When he met her, she was the hostess at an LA club.
Right, and it's and if you're interested in exploring the Spector story in that regard to that particular crime, there are lots of avenues. I mean, it's just, it was one of the most covered trials in American history, in part because of Spector's fame or infamy. But what we really would like to do is to focus more on Spector, the individual. But I think it's worth noting that he is behind bars and has been behind bars for a long time, and is he's a very peculiar guy. So where do we want to go with this now?
Yeah, and just in the context of the murder that he is serving time for. He took this 40-year-old hostess and, as I said, part-time actress back to his castle.
The Alhambra castle.
Evening, yes. At the end of one of the evenings, he would often go out on the town and be driven around to several places and sometimes have several dates in one night. Right. But somehow he ended up taking her back to his place. And shortly after they arrived, the chauffeur heard a shot, and Phil Spector came out and said, "Oh, I think I've killed somebody."
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And that language, those words were used against him in court. I suppose, though, the other thing about Spector and the legal process that followed the killing of Clarkson was his presentation, his demeanor, his look in the courtroom, which was, I think, by most measures, pretty outlandish. It's what we've got here, of course, is Spector as in a various number of wigs. He wore a hairpiece for a long time, really for a long time. But what he did during the legal proceedings was, well, he would put on a number of really outlandish hairpieces, outlandish wigs. And it added to, it certainly didn't help his case in any way, and it certainly made the notion that he was unbalanced. It certainly brought a lot of, I don't know what, a lot of credibility to that notion. He just, he seemed to be a person not really in touch with a certain kind of reality.
And apparently Jackson got his inspiration for the character Gollum from Buckshot.
Yeah, it's a bizarre thing, but he'll be eligible for parole in a few years, and we'll see what happens. He'll be a very old man. It's interesting, though, that the Spector estate still collects a lot of money. I think you can argue that he's still a very, very wealthy man, in part because of this enormous back catalog that he was responsible for, that really dates back to the late 1950s. And so I think it probably at this point we transitioned and think a little bit about the young Spector and how he became again a part of the music industry. And so,
and I think he recognized very early on how important it was to have control, to have your name as author, your name as producer, to have your studio producing these things. He had control over nearly every element of the production, almost right up into distribution questions.
now absolutely, and by doing so, he not only had control, artistic control, but he also then was able to garner revenue in ways that were unusual. And so he became an extraordinarily wealthy man at an extraordinarily young age. I guess that
I would suggest that part of what led to that was the very first hit that he had with his group, Teddy Bears. It was a trio made of himself and two kids that he knew from high school. And his first big hit was with this group. To know him is to love him. And he noticed that he was getting screwed on, well, not just royalties, but just payment, just basic. They didn't earn anything for that record. So I think that was his first introduction to the music industry, and knowing, okay, if I'm going to actually want to make a living at this, I've got to make sure that the money that the records are making actually gets to me.
Yeah, and the teddy bear experience, I think, is an interesting one, as you say, a really informative one. But it speaks to how early Spector got into the business. So Spector, as a young man in California, Southern California, was entering into the music business in the late 1950s. And in the late 1950s, right, the dominant form of music in the United States is still a kind of doo-wop. And so, right, so the teddy bears, right, become this overnight sensation. Spector is the individual on the left. But right, it was, I mean, for all the adulation that you receive as a young music star, Spector was, as you're suggesting, really kind of hurt and angered and embittered by the experience, and really vowed to sort of change the rules. And so he changed the rules. but all this action is happening in Southern California. And Spector really benefited from the fact that he was able to sort of plug into a group of musicians, a group of young producers, and kind of just make his way into the scene. It's worth noting that Southern California, which was the home of the recording industry in this era, and really for almost any era, was still a relatively small place. That there were a finite number of people involved in the recording and engineering of records. And if you got yourself into that scene, you could travel through it really quickly. And he did. And so what was one of the things that makes Spector, I think, interesting is that he accomplished something that would be almost impossible today, right? The idea that as a kind of high school kid, that you can make your way into the studio scene and suddenly, in a span of like a few months, be engineering, producing records and selling these records. I mean, that's impossible today, but it was possible back in that era where LA and the recording scene was really a kind of small town.
And as long as we're talking about the Teddy Bears in the first hit, we might as well talk about what inspired to know him is to love him, because
yeah,
and that probably gives
absolutely
a really good clue as to Spector's personality and his conflicts and his dark side. Steve, you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Spector's a kid in New York, and as a young man, his father, Ben Spector, commits suicide. I believe that Spector was 9 years old. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and he was old enough to have interacted and to have a strong relationship with his dad. And I mean, it's no great surprise that a suicide of a parent when you're a young person would be extraordinarily detrimental. And there's every reason to believe that this it really influenced Spector in a profound way. And
well, and beyond that, even apparently his mother blamed him for his father's suicide, which is just wow.
Wow. I mean, it's just a wow. And so this is Spector's father's gravestone in New York. And it is, as you can see here at the bottom, to know him was to love him, which would be a refrain that Spector then would use with his first big hit, which really, I think if you put those things together, it's really, I don't know if ghoulish is the word, but it's profoundly disturbing on some level. But Spector was deeply shaped by this experience of his father being killed and his mother sort of jumping on him and casting the blame. And so they relocate. And this is I think the key piece is then that they relocate to Southern California. Had Spector remained in New York, I think he was a person who was driven. He had a person who had a gift, and he probably would have become involved in the music business, brill building, this kind of thing. He had some connections there anyway. But to the Spector that we know as this kind of bigger than life mythological figure, I don't think would have happened without the move to Southern California. He needed that. He needed the connection with the session musicians of the Wrecking Crew. But the move to California was really big.
Well, and interestingly enough, even after this first hit, he was considering a career as a simultaneous interpreter at the UN, and went back to New York to take that job.
Yeah.
And never ended up doing that. Did spend one day at the UN, but went to the offices of Stoller and Lieber, who were two guys that were working out of the Brill building, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were producers, and a friend of his from back in California who was involved with Teddy Bears kind of gave him a reference and said, look, give this kid a try. And so they did. And he actually lived at one of their houses for a while.
Yeah, he was, there's no question that he was embraced by the music community and by those in the Brill building. I think they recognized his talent. It's easy to sort of dismiss Spector as a very, very unusual, unbalanced, unstable. Okay, he was all that, but he also was magnificently talented. He had a real gift. He had a real ear for music. He played music. He played guitar. He wrote. He could sing. He had a genuine gift, and I think for many people who are profoundly gifted, they also struggle in other areas, right? That they're challenged socially, and certainly every account that you read of Spector as a young person suggests that he had those kinds of challenges, right? That he would be subject to just explosive outbursts of temper and anger, something that was coming out of the blue. He had a particular well, he wanted people to be where they were supposed to be. And he was, a kind of puppet master in that regard. And so if he said, be here at a certain time, you need to be here at a certain time, or you'd be subject to his wrath. But the other thing about Spector is that he was a great guy. He was the best guy. And that people who spent time with him, they genuinely loved him. They saw Spector for what he was. He had this dark side, but when Spector was connecting with you, it was a magical relationship. And this dates back to his time in the Brill building, and it spans all the way really even to his time working with people like Leonard Cohen and the Ramones to some degree. He was many things. He was many things, but he did definitely have the advantage of being, embraced by the best of the best in the Brill building.
Well, and the other thing is, beyond just his skills, he had a vision of a different type of pop music.
Yes,
He wanted
absolutely.
to realize in the studio, and it was different. It was something that had not been there before. And this whole wall of sound, this idea, we're going to make symphonies for the kids, and they're going to love it. This is what they've been waiting for.
That's right.
Not something that anyone else would have ever thought, but he was absolutely right. He was dead on. And it led to things like the Ronettes with Be My Baby, a song that, according to his own account, blew Brian Wilson's mind when he heard it. It was just something so entirely different than anything that he had heard on the radio before. He was out on driving with his girlfriend and had to pull the car over and said, "What the hell is this?"
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And apparently he has listened to it like every day since, at least once. Be My Baby. He was just incredibly impressed by that. Then Brian Wilson started hanging out at Phil Spector recording sessions.
That's exactly right. So let's look at this for a second, because this work with the Ronettes all happens in LA, where Spector is now working closely with the best session musicians probably in the world, certainly in California, the Wrecking Crew.
And arranger composer Jack Mitchell.
That's right.
It's also an interesting connection.
Yeah, Nietzsche's a super important figure. He's a kind of Zelig figure. Every kind of important moment in music, there he is. Nietzsche's there. But so you see here, Spector working with the group. One of the things that's interesting, for example, about "Be My Baby" is that there's a certain kind of propulsive element to it. And we'll have it in the playlist, and you can listen to it for yourself. I'm sure you're familiar with the song, but there is just a propulsive kind of percussive element that just keeps that song rocking. What Spector would do with the musicians was he would be a kind of micromanager with everyone. For example, you can see the guitarist in the foreground. He would show guitarists the fingering that he wanted, he just everything, every note. But with the percussion, famously, he left them alone. Dudes, you do what you want to do. And there is something about Spector records, particularly involving percussion, that is really unusual. And in part, I think it's because he kind of left it alone and let the percussion guys do what they really wanted to do. And be my
Well, in this case, we're talking about Hal Blaine, right? With the
yeah,
Wrecking
absolutely,
Crew.
yeah.
Oh, can you go back to the picture just a second?
Sure.
Because over Spector's left shoulder is another popular figure from pop music. Do you know who that is?
Well, it looks like one Sonny Bono.
It's Sonny Bono. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the Sonny Bono. Yeah, Sonny Bono became a kind of impresario under Spector's watch. Sonny Bono just sort of started to show up at studios. The musicians described him as a nice kid, and that Spector gave Sonny a lot of chances to be on records, oftentimes playing a tambourine or something like that. But Sonny learned from the master, right? And Sonny then, of course, went on to great fame, working alongside Cher, who was also part of the Wrecking Crew as a background singer. But yeah, Sonny Bono became kind of his right-hand man for a while in these early days in California. Sonny Bono, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so, well, we were talking about Be My Baby and so on. Along with the Crystals, the Ronettes was one of the main that Phil S. Records had going, because by this point, Spector had started his own record company.
That's right.
With a mentor, essentially, who he soon bought out. I think by this point, Phil S. Records was entirely a Spector.
I think that's right. Yeah, from top to bottom, he controlled it. And at this point, then he really starts to hitch his wagon to. I think it's fair to say that he the Ronettes become sort of the defining group, right? That whatever the wall of sound was, and whoever Phil Spector was, it was very much connected to Ronnie Spector and the Ronettes, who had a number of hits with, and had a very interesting and tumultuous relation with Ronnie Spector, who we're looking at here.
Was also an incredibly charismatic person, and continued even beyond her early career and beyond their marriage, to be a well-received and popular person in pop and rock circles. She would party with or date the likes of John Lennon and David Bowie and all these people. So.
And Ronnie Spector, as you're suggesting, had this incredible charisma and this just fantastic voice. But she was very deeply meshed with Phil Spector, and I think it's during this time where they fall in love, and Spector is traveling with the Ronettes, that he makes a number of interesting connections. He starts to spend time with bigger groups because the Ronettes are traveling all over the world with groups in England.
Well, they did a concert with the Stones,
right? With
the Stones opening for the Ronettes.
Yeah, I mean, for example,
yeah.
Such was the Ronettes' popularity. But making connections with the Stones, and then also roughly at that same time, then I guess it would be '64 with the Beatles. These connections would pay dividends for Spector down the road, and arguably, I would say even elevate him to a different kind of status. That working with, certainly working with the Beatles. Well, it was profoundly important in that era, without question.
He apparently met the Beatles on their transatlantic flight to conquer America. They were coming over. And he was on that flight, and he became known among the Beatles as the man who walked to America. Because apparently he didn't sit down the entire time. He was walking back and forth and just talking a mile a minute.
Yeah, like yeah, like
And
so. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And just talking John's ear off. John loved it because he had been a fan of Spector's going back. He said Spector saved rock and roll in the 2.5 years that Elvis was in the army.
Right.
So they were it was a kind of a mutual fan club right from the very beginning.
I'd say it's fair to say that Spector, I mean, the Beatles were enamored with him. He's a bigger than life personality. He's like super famous at this point, and he's also gregarious and incredibly charming. I mean, it's the thing that we can't lose sight of is that Spector was, people like to hang out with him. He was alive. He was vibrant. But he really made deep connections with John and George. I would say that of the Beatles, John for sure, and George as well, really appreciated Spector and also appreciated what he had to deliver or to give in the studio. I think it's fair to say that McCartney was less enamored with Spector's style and would famously sort of balk at it during the Let It Be sessions. But Spector and the Beatles were, they were deeply connected. Really made
when we talk about this, one thing that I've never heard in connection with Phil Spector is diagnosis of a manic depressive syndrome. But it just seems to me like everything that you read about him really suggests that that's what was going on.
Well, I think, I mean, I think that this notion of him being bipolar, I think is absolutely the case. And I also think that he was certainly blessed and cursed with narcissism. So he was, I think had he lived in a different era, he would have, I mean, he would have, his moods would have been, I think, less extreme. But the thing about it is that, again, so many people who have this incredible talent also have, they also struggle with mental illness. And so,
what never what never helps in a situation like that is the drugs. And he was pills all the time, like they were candy. And that had to have complicated the whole situation.
So absolutely, there's no question about that. And so by the time we get to the mid 1960s, the wall of sound is part of the modern pop lexicon. And Phil Spector is a kind of bigger than life figure. I mean, quite famously, he appears on I Dream of Jeannie, playing himself, right? Because, I mean, hell, everybody knows Spector. And so he is, and he also has a cameo in Easy Rider. He is a kind of cultural figure.
Okay, let's before you go on, let's talk about that time period, the mid '60s. I think there are two hits that we need to make reference here. One is the Righteous Brothers.
Oh,
You Lost That Loving Feeling.
Loving Feeling, yeah.
Which was a huge hit for him, a huge hit for them. Apparently, Bobby. The Righteous Brothers were not brothers.
Bobby Hatfield.
Yes, Bobby Hatfield was not happy because
Right. Famous.
It was not. Phil said he made a lot of money on it, but he wouldn't stop complaining. He never did understand. You Lost That Loving Feeling was not a duet. Never was. But
right. Well, I mean,
huge hit for all of them.
Huge hit for all of them. I mean, yeah, but Spector. Well, Spector famously would do what Phil wanted to do, and so I mean, after that point, right, the Righteous Brothers had been, clearly had been a duet, not for that particular song. And the other tune, Dave, of note from that era would be what?
Well, why don't you say it? Just spit it right out.
Well, why don't you spit it right out?
Okay. Phil Spector had discovered for himself Tina Turner.
Yeah.
Amazed by Tina Turner. And she was under contract with another company, which was also, it was owned by Ike and Tina Turner's agent. So he had negotiations and bought their contract and got into the studio. And the first thing that they did was they made River Deep, Mountain High.
Now, River Deep Mountain High today is considered kind of one of the seminal pieces coming out of the 60s. That it's just, that it's just a kind of tour de force for Tina Turner. Just, a song for the ages in a way. But when it was released, it didn't do well. It didn't sell a lot. It did.
Well, and there are some conspiracy theories behind that about
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
all sorts of people in the industry that hated Spector, were envious of him, and were out to just bat him down. And that they did this by basically ignoring this tour de force and got no airplay. Didn't sell very much, although he had ordered like 125,000 advance copies.
Right.
Couldn't get rid of them.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, because in Spector's ears, in Spector's mind, he knew that this would be one of the great songs ever. And so, and Spector.
And people like Lennon and Harrison were telling him, "Man, you've got a huge hit there.
Right.
Congratulations." Harrison went on to say that it is the perfect song. There's no way to improve on it. So he was hearing a lot of critical voices saying, "Fantastic," but it did nothing commercially.
Which I think, okay, and it did nothing commercially.
Except in Europe. It was number one in Spain.
That's right. Yeah,
number 10 in top 10 in England, the Netherlands, but in America.
And interestingly, to that point, Tina Turner, who eventually went on to a solo career, was very popular in the United States, certainly during the 1980s, for example. But she was enormously popular in Europe and remains so today. And this was really, I think, to some degree, sort of the start of her fame in Europe with this song. But I think this speaks to Spector's insecurity. He really took this. I mean, he's Phil Spector, for God's sake. I mean, so a song doesn't chart or whatever, but it just floored him. It just was a devastating blow. And I think you can argue that he really never, I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze, but he's really never recovered from it on some level.
Well, I think a lot of people have said that. And certainly it sent him into semi-retirement.
That's it. Yeah. So
he did not come back out of until John Lennon contacted him to work on the Imagine album.
I have a question about that. When did Spector get involved in the Let It Be sessions?
After the work with Lennon.
So he went back. Okay, so he went back to work with the material that they had recorded. They had cut in two different studios.
Right.
And they just couldn't really come to. I mean, they had disintegrated because they couldn't figure out how to.
They were burned out. Yeah, just. Nobody really wanted to work on getting it wrapped up.
Well,
not satisfied with the work of John Glenn. Was that the name?
Glenn Johns. Yeah, Glenn Johns.
Glenn Johns. Yeah, Glenn Johns.
That's right.
And so he brought Spector in to take over and to finish it up. That was after the work on his album.
Okay, that's okay. All right, that's helpful. And that album, the Let It Be sessions, and the Let It Be recording, it's, I don't know, notorious is too strong a word, but there's a lot of dissension amongst Beatles purists about Spector's work on it. And McCartney in particular, right, was really dissatisfied with how that turned out. To the point, right, where McCartney, decades later, then re-released it, basically extracting the work or whatever you want to say that Spector did, right? The Let It Be Naked, release.
About 30 years later, I'm not sure exactly, but it was it was something obviously that had eaten at him the entire time until he was able to do it. He just really, really was unhappy. Although he had signed off on it.
Yeah, that's
Hesitates, you know, and this is something that that confused some people, among other Spector. Spector had also asked the Beatles if they had any problems, if there was anything that they wanted to work on together to get this thing wrapped up.
right.
It was crickets. They were all just finished with it. And it's just afterwards that that McCartney had his.
Yeah, and most famously, that he objected to Spector's work on Long and Winding Road.
Right.
Most famously. It's also, you know, I hesitate to go down this road a little bit, but this is also the time where Spector has become wed to Ronnie Spector. They have, and that period is in the mid to late 60s into it's a very dark period. And Ronnie Spector, in a biography in 1990, wrote about it to great detail. A number of stories emerge about Spector's behavior during that time.
Really strange stuff.
You know, Ronnie Spector wakes up on her wedding day to the sound of construction outside, and looks out the window, and workmen are putting bars over the window.
They're building the Berlin Wall out there.
That's exactly right. He puts in this, you know, this intercom system in the house, and so that he can track her movements within the house. He monitors all her phone calls. It's just endless, the amount of strange behavior, and frankly abusive behavior that engages
on one of her mother's rare visits. He takes her down to the basement and shows her the glass casket that he had made for Ronnie in case she ever tried to leave him.
That's right. I mean, it's I don't know where you go from that. I really don't. Again, and there are countless explorations of Spector's peculiar and abusive behavior. I would recommend, however, Ronnie Spector's autobiography from 1990, "Be My Baby," where she lays this out in some detail. It's honest to God, it's really actually fairly chilling to read about Spector and his, not only his abuse to his wife, but also then to their children. It's just blood curdling on some level. But despite all,
they didn't have any children themselves. They had no children, but they adopted, and with their first adopted child, he insisted that they give it out as their own, as a child that they had together.
Yeah,
it's all very strange stuff. Yeah.
He famously or infamously presents a set of twins to Ronnie as a Christmas present. For years, the twins are not allowed to interact with the older child. For years, the twins are locked in their rooms except for meals and to go to school. I mean, it's just like, it's unbelievable. But the thing is that while all this shit is going on, he's getting back into the game a little bit, working with people like Lennon and George Harrison. And so I think that, right, I think we'd agree that to some degree, Spector seals his legacy as a producer with his work with Lennon, famously with the single "Imagine," and with Harrison, with Harrison's initial solo LP, "All Things Must Pass." I mean,
and the big hit, "My Sweet Lord."
My Sweet Lord. My Sweet Lord. That's Spector's work on My Sweet Lord, I think is amazing. I think it really benefits the song. And by the time you get to the end of My Sweet Lord, it becomes almost this, just this amazing kind of cacophony of sound and chants. And it's just really quite a journey that you go on in 4 minutes. I would counter that though with another single from that album, "What Is Life," that is completely destroyed by Spector's production. And we'll put it in the playlist if you want to take a listen to it, including then the inclusion of mariachi horns, which I just think it's an abomination. And so So with Spector, it's always the good with the bad, but those two Beatles that he works with, I think it's really important. It's also, I think, worth noting that Spector claims a Grammy Award, right, for his work with Harrison and friends with the concert for Bangladesh in the early 1970s, which is a noteworthy achievement in that it's really the first large-scale rock and roll event aimed at a specific kind of charity. And that LP has sold millions of copies, and Spector was rewarded for his work on that.
In later career, I think you've already mentioned he worked with the Ramones.
End of the Century LP.
Situations where in the studio he pulled a gun and threatened D.D. Ramone, play faster, play better, or else.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. I don't think the Ramones had a good word to say about him at all. I think it was a really,
well. I think they were satisfied with the results.
I think they were, but the personal interaction was nightmarish.
Was not good.
Was not good.
Worked with Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting pairing. I confess I don't know much about how the Cohen and Spector got together. Do you not know much about that?
Cohen had been invited to a party at the castle, and
Of course.
really regretted going, but he didn't get out of there fast enough. And by the time he was ready to leave, Spector locked the door and said, "You're not going anywhere." So we decided to try to make the best of it, and they talked about music and suggested, well, why don't we write some songs together? And over the next week, they wrote about 15 songs together and really clicked.
Again, so when Spector's on, I mean, he's amazing.
But in the studio, Cohen came time and Spector put a gun to his neck and said, "I love you, Leonard."
Oh, yeah.
Cohen said, "I really hope you do."
Really hope you do. Yeah, that's quite one of Cohen's more famous lines. Yeah. Yeah.
That was Death of a Ladies' Man. That was the worst selling Leonard Cohen album of all time.
And this speaks to when Midas loses his touch a little bit, and I think certainly in the later years, in the 70s and into the 80s, whatever Spector had, he had lost, and I don't think he had a real good sense of what the public wanted to hear, and I do think he made some unusual choices in terms of people to work with. I mean, working with Leonard Cohen is almost inexplicable, but. Cohen did it, but
I think the last time, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think the last time he was in the studio was with Celine Dion. And,
yes, I think that's right.
And that was for her Falling Into You album. She had appeared on the David Letterman show singing River Deep Mountain High.
Yeah, that's right.
Paul Schaefer called Phil Spector and said, "Look, you should listen to this," and played the tape for him. And so they decided he decided to produce her next album. And it seems to be kind of a holy grail for some people to get
I think that's right.
songs that were actually produced, because they're supposed to be very, very good. But right. His treatment of the diva was not appreciated by the record company, by her husband, manager.
I think that's fair. Yeah, didn't like him one bit. Do
you know who he was replaced by?
No, I don't know. Go ahead. I don't. Ooh.
Jim Steinman.
Holy crap. Okay, so that's interesting. Steinman, who grew up in Long Island, famously produced Meatloaf, the Bat Out of
Hell. Yeah.
Very operatic and over the top kind of. Yeah, a kind of Spector wannabe in a way, right?
Right. Well, Spector said of him, he's a clone of me.
Spector without the guns. Wow, Jim Steinman. Oh, okay. Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, to wrap up, Spector, it's I mean, there's no story that parallels this. I mean, he's a singular figure in music history, and I think in American cultural history. And he's a difficult figure to fully embrace, given, you know, everything that he's done or alleged to have done. But Dave, what would be your assessment in terms of just Spector and American music? I mean, what's important about Spector when you hear the name Phil Spector? What should you kind of connect that to in terms of music?
Well, he was a titan. I said before, it's not just his talent and the vision that he brought. That's something that really had not been there before and probably never would have been there without Phil Spector. This whole wall of sound, this whole
That's right.
symphony idea, probably never would have come up. And it influenced a number of other really, really talented people. And it's impossible to imagine the American pop scene without him. It would look nothing like it does today.
I think it's a fair characterization. He's a very difficult person to embrace, but his talent is undeniable. His impact on music is undeniable. And we are, I think, you know, we're in debt to him on some level for the music that he helped to produce. It's just really some of the great music of American history. I mean, that stuff from the early 60s in particular is just, it stands apart from anything else that was recorded in that time. So, well, there we go. Phil Spector, a very unusual cat, but somebody worth remembering and somebody worth acknowledging here. So we will talk to you all soon. And until then, we hope everybody is well. And Dave, you got a final thought here.
Well, remember, if you like this video, want to see other videos like it, you can subscribe right here. Or definitely check out the playlist. You'll have a chance to see the work of Phil Spector if you look right here. And another one of our behind the curtain videos can be seen if you click on it right here.
Absolutely. All right. So everybody, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.